The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into the wrists of a man who had once bled for the very soil he was standing on. To Officer Smith Collins, the quiet black man in the faded field jacket was just a trespasser, a criminal casing the perimeter of Fort Reynolds. He slammed the cruiser door, blind to the fact that he had just arrested a decorated war hero. By the time the truth surfaced, a career would be shattered, and a city would be brought to its knees. The morning of November 9th hung heavy over the Virginia foothills, draped in a thick, slate-grey fog that seemed to swallow the towering pines surrounding Fort Reynolds. It was a Tuesday, the kind of biting, damp morning where the cold seeped straight through bone and settled in the joints. For retired Master Sergeant Cole Pendleton, the cold was more than just a passing discomfort. It was a physical reminder of a life left behind in the jagged mountains of the Korengal Valley. Every step he took on his left leg sent a dull electric throb up his thigh, a phantom echo originating from a limb he had lost to an improvised explosive device 8 years prior. Now, titanium and carbon fiber did the work of flesh and bone. Cole sat behind the wheel of his 2004 Ford F-150, the heater struggling to push lukewarm air into the cab. He was 39 years old, though the deep lines at the corners of his eyes and the stark grey, dusting his close-cropped hair, made him look 10 years older. He wore a simple, olive-drab field jacket, devoid of patches or insignia, over a black thermal shirt and worn denim jeans. Tucked into his breast pocket was a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed seal of the Department of Defense. It was a personal invitation from Base Commander General Thomas Hayes. Today was the anniversary of the ambush that had claimed the lives of 4 of Cole's men, and a private memorial was being held at the base's interior chapel. Cole pulled his truck onto a narrow, gravel-access road that bordered the municipal jurisdiction of the nearby town of Oak Ridge and the federal property line of Fort Reynolds. He was heading for the North Gate, a specialized entrance reserved for high-ranking officers, military logistics, and VIP guests. To get there, he had to navigate a stretch of county road that snaked along the base's towering chain-link perimeter. Cole pulled over onto a designated gravel turnout, just shy of the gate's primary checkpoint. He needed a moment. His chest was tight. The anniversary always did this to him, a suffocating cocktail of grief, survivor's guilt, and crushing anxiety. He turned off the engine, stepping out into the frigid morning air to clear his head. He leaned against the rusty quarter panel of his truck, pulling in deep, ragged breaths of the pine-scented air, his eyes tracing the razor wire atop the fence. Half a mile down the road, idling behind the crumbling brick sign of an abandoned gas station, sat Oak Ridge police officer Smith Collins. Collins was 26, barely 3 years out of the academy, and fueled by a restless, toxic ambition. He despised traffic duty. He despised the sleepy nature of Oak Ridge. He wanted action, the kind of high-stakes policing he watched on television, the kind that earned commendations from Chief Richard Harrison. Collins sat in his cruiser, sipping bitter gas station coffee, his eyes scanning the fog for anything that could break the monotony of his shift. When Collins saw the battered Ford F-150 pull into the turnout near the base perimeter, his posture stiffened. The turnout was technically on county land, but it abutted a restricted military zone. The signs clearly read, "No loitering." Federal property boundary. Collins picked up his binoculars. Through the magnified lenses, he watched a tall, broad-shouldered black man step out of the truck. The man was dressed in rugged clothing, pacing slowly, seemingly studying the fence line. He lingered. He looked down at the ground, then back up at the guard towers in the distance. To Cole, it was a moment of silent prayer, a solitary communion with the ghosts of his past. To Officer Collins, It was textbook suspicious behavior, casing the perimeter, Collins thought, his pulse quickening. Looking for a weak point, probably trying to strip copper wire from the old depot, or worse. Collins didn't see a man battling invisible demons. He saw a profile. He saw a rusted truck, a dilapidated jacket, and a man who, in his prejudiced estimation, did not belong anywhere near the pristine, high-security gates of Fort Reynolds. Collins dropped the binoculars onto the passenger seat and slammed his cruiser into drive. The tires spun on the damp asphalt as he accelerated down the county road. He didn't radio dispatch immediately. He wanted to handle this himself. He wanted to roll up with a suspect in custody and prove to the brass that he was a proactive, sharp-eyed lawman. As the roar of the cruiser's engine broke the morning silence, Cole slowly turned his head. He watched the Oak Ridge police vehicle approaching at an unsafe speed, its light bar remaining dark, but its intent clear. Cole let out a long, slow sigh. He had dealt with overzealous local cops before. He knew the drill. He stood perfectly still, keeping his hands visible, resting them on the bed of his truck. He decided to let the officer say his piece, show his military ID, and be on his way. He had no idea that Officer Smith Collins had already made up his mind, and that the situation was about to spiral out of control. The police cruiser skidded to a halt at a 45-degree angle, aggressively blocking Cole's truck from pulling back onto the road. The driver's side door flew open, and Officer Collins stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his sidearm. "Hey, you!" Collins barked, his voice echoing sharply in the damp air. "Step away from the fence." Cole did not flinch. His military career had conditioned him to remain unshakable under direct fire. A shouting local cop barely registered on his adrenal scale. He turned fully toward the officer, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. "Good morning, officer," Cole said, his voice a deep, calm baritone. "I'm not on the fence line. I'm just taking a moment before I head into the base." Collins closed the distance, his eyes darting aggressively over Cole's attire. "You're heading into the base? Looking like that?" "I don't think so. This is a restricted area, buddy. I need to see your ID, and I need to see it right now." "Of course," Cole replied evenly. He slowly moved his right hand toward the inner pocket of his field jacket. "I didn't say reach into your jacket," Collins yelled, stepping back and unclipping the retention strap on his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see them, on the hood of the truck, now." Cole froze. He recognized the dangerous cocktail of fear and arrogance in the young officer's eyes. It was the same look young privates got when a patrol went south, the look of someone who was operating purely on adrenaline rather than training. Cole knew that one wrong move, however innocent, could result in a bullet. Slowly, deliberately, Cole placed both of his large hands flat on the cold metal hood of his Ford. "Officer, my wallet is in my breast pocket. Inside it is my Department of Defense identification. I am an invited guest of General Hayes at Fort Reynolds. If you'd like to retrieve it yourself, you are welcome to do so." Collins scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Yeah, sure you are. And I'm the president." "Spread your legs." Cole took a shallow breath. "Officer, I need to inform you that I am an amputee. My left leg is a prosthetic. I can spread my stance, but my balance—" "I said spread 'em," Collins interrupted, moving in quickly. He grabbed Cole by the back of his collar and shoved him roughly against the hood. The force of the shove threw Cole off balance. The titanium rod of his prosthetic shifted awkwardly against the gravel, and his knee buckled slightly. He caught himself, his massive arms absorbing the impact against the truck. A flare of phantom pain shot through his stump, causing him to grit his teeth. "Stop resisting," Collins yelled, completely misinterpreting Cole's physical stumble. "I am not resisting," Cole said, his voice dropping an octave. taking on the hardened, authoritative edge that had once commanded platoons in the deadliest valleys on Earth. "I lost my leg in combat. Watch what you are doing." Collins ignored him. Operating on a toxic loop of self-justification, the officer kicked his heavy boot against the inside of Cole's left ankle to force his legs further apart. Instead of yielding flesh, Collins' boot struck solid titanium, hidden beneath the denim. The metallic clink was unmistakable. Collins jumped back, his mind racing to the worst possible conclusion. A weapon. He thought the man had a rifle barrel or a pipe strapped to his leg. "He's got something in his pants," Collins muttered to himself, his panic spiking. Before Cole could speak, Collins lunged forward, grabbing Cole's left arm and twisting it violently behind his back. Cole's combat reflexes flared. For a fraction of a second, his muscles coiled. He could have broken the officer's grip, swept his legs, and had him pinned to the gravel before the man could draw a breath. It was muscle memory, ingrained by years of hand-to-hand combat training. But Cole's discipline overrode his instinct. He forced his body to go limp, allowing the officer to wrench his arm upward, though the angle tore painfully at an old shoulder injury. "Do not make this a worse mistake than it already is," Cole warned, his voice remarkably steady despite the pain. "You are detaining a retired Master Sergeant of the United States Army on the perimeter of a federal installation." "Shut up," Collins barked, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. He snapped the cold steel around Cole's left wrist, then yanked his right arm back, securing the cuffs tightly. He clicked them down to the last notch, the metal digging painfully into the thick, raised scars on Cole's wrists. Scars earned from shrapnel in a Humvee explosion. Collins patted Cole down aggressively, his hands running down Cole's left leg. When he felt the hard, mechanical shape of the prosthetic, he paused, a brief flash of confusion crossing his face. But his pride would not let him back down now. He had already escalated the situation. He couldn't unarrest the man without looking foolish. Trespassing, resisting a lawful order, and lying to a police officer. Collins listed, panting slightly as he grabbed Cole by the bicep. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." Cole turned his head slightly, locking his dark, weary eyes onto the young officer's face. There was no fear in Cole's gaze, only a profound, chilling pity. "You didn't even check my pocket," Cole whispered. Collins shoved him toward the cruiser. "I don't need to look at your fake ID. We're going to the North Gate. I'm handing you over to the military police. Let's see what they do to guys who case their perimeter." Cole didn't fight as he was forced into the cramped back seat of the Dodge Charger. He had to awkwardly manipulate his stiff, artificial leg to fit inside the plastic molded seats. The door slammed shut, trapping him in the claustrophobic, cage-like back of the police car. Collins slid into the driver's seat, snatching his radio microphone. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have one suspect in custody. Apprehended trespassing and acting suspicious on the federal boundary near Sector 4. I am proceeding to the North Gate to transfer custody to military personnel." Static crackled over the radio. "Copy that, Unit 4. Do you need a supervisor on scene?" "Negative," Collins replied, a smug smile creeping onto his face as he looked at Cole in the rearview mirror. "Situation is completely under control. I caught him before he could try anything." Collins put the car in gear and pulled away from the gravel turnout, leaving Cole's truck sitting alone in the fog. He had his prize. He was bringing a supposed criminal right to the doorstep of the military, expecting a pat on the back. He had no idea he was driving straight into a nightmare of his own making. The drive to the North Gate took less than 3 minutes, but in the oppressive silence of the police cruiser, it felt like an eternity. Officer Collins drove with one hand draped casually over the steering wheel, his posture radiating a smug, unearned victory. He occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see fear or submission in his prisoner's eyes. Instead, he saw only a stoic, impenetrable calm. Cole sat upright, though the awkward angle of his cuffed hands sent dull spikes of agony radiating through his heavily scarred shoulders. He stared straight ahead through the heavy wire mesh separating the front and back seats. He wasn't thinking about the arrogant rookie driving the car. He was thinking about the 4 names etched into his memory. Miller. Vance. No, Henderson. Jackson. Davis. He was supposed to be reading those names aloud in a quiet chapel right now. Instead, he was being paraded like a trophy. You know, you people always think you can just wander wherever you want, Collins sneered, unable to endure the silence. This base is vital to national security. The men inside there are heroes. They don't need local vagrants poking around their fence lines trying to steal scrap metal. Cole didn't blink. You speak very highly of men you know nothing about, he said quietly. Collins let out a harsh laugh. I know enough to know you don't belong here. The cruiser rounded a sharp bend in the pine-lined road, and the north gate came into view. Unlike the sprawling, heavily trafficked main civilian entrances to Fort Reynolds, the north gate was a fortress of pragmatism. Massive concrete barriers were arranged in a serpentine layout to prevent vehicle ramming. Heavy steel bollards stood sentry beneath a towering, reinforced guardhouse. The area was illuminated by glaring halogen floodlights that cut through the lingering morning fog. Standing beneath the awning of the guardhouse were 2 military police officers, Sergeant David Miller and Corporal James Davies. Both men were armed with M4 carbines slung across their chests, their uniforms crisp, their faces set in the stern, immovable expressions required of gate duty. Collins pulled his cruiser directly into the center lane, flashing his light bar once to announce his arrival. He shifted the car into park and stepped out, adjusting his duty belt to ensure he looked the part of a commanding, in-charge local lawman. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his tactical vest. He was a seasoned MP, a man who had seen a decade of service, and had little patience for local cops who thought they were cowboys. Morning, officer, Miller said, his voice flat, projecting over the idle of the police cruiser's engine. Can we help you with something? You're blocking the VIP lane. Morning, Sergeant, Collins said, walking around the front of his cruiser with a swagger that made Miller internally roll his eyes. I brought you boys a little present. Found this guy creeping around the perimeter fence down by Sector 4. Refused to explain what he was doing, gave me attitude, so I locked him up. Figured since he was casing your property line, you'd want first crack at him before I take him downtown and book him. Miller frowned, his brow furrowing. Casing the perimeter? What was he doing? Just lurking, Collins said dismissively. Claimed he was a guest of the general. You know how these guys are. Anything to get out of a ticket. I patted him down, secured him, and brought him right to you. Corporal Davies exchanged a quick, skeptical glance with Sergeant Miller. Did you identify him? Davies asked. Didn't need to, Collins replied, gesturing toward the back of his cruiser. He's got some fake military ID he claims is in his pocket, but I wasn't about to let him reach for it. He's restrained in the back. Miller's expression hardened. He hated sloppy police work, and everything about this young Oak Ridge cop screamed amateur. You detained a man without checking his identification, and you brought him onto a federal installation. I caught him on the boundary, Collins defended, his smile faltering slightly under the MP's stern gaze. I'm trying to do you guys a favor here. Let's see him, Miller said abruptly. Collins turned, walked to the rear door of the cruiser, and yanked it open. All right, buddy, out you go. Let's show the military what a real trespasser looks like. Cole shifted in the back seat. Because his hands were cuffed behind him, and because of the stiffness of his prosthetic leg, it took him a moment to maneuver his body out of the cramped space. He swung his legs out first, his boots hitting the pavement. Slowly, maintaining his dignity despite the awkwardness of the movement, Cole stood up to his full 6'2" height. The harsh halogen lights of the guardhouse washed over Cole's face, highlighting the deep scars along his jawline and the unmistakable weary posture of a combat veteran. Sergeant Miller took one step forward and then froze. The air in the checkpoint seemed to instantly vanish. The annoyance on Miller's face melted away, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. His jaw slacked, and the color drained rapidly from his weathered face. Corporal Davies, standing a few feet behind Miller, dropped his clipboard. It clattered loudly against the asphalt, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet morning. Collins, completely misreading the MP's reactions, smirked. "See? Told you he looked suspicious. Guys like this." "Shut your mouth," Sergeant Miller snapped. It wasn't a request, it was a military command, delivered with such sudden, venomous authority that Collins physically took a step back, his eyes widening. Miller completely ignored the local cop now. He closed the distance to the police cruiser in 2 long strides. He stopped 3 feet from Cole, his eyes moving from Cole's face down to the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists, and back up again. "Master Sergeant Pendleton?" Miller breathed, his voice trembling with a mixture of reverence and absolute horror. Cole offered a small, grim smile. "Hello, David. It's been a while." "Sir," Miller stammered, looking helplessly at the handcuffs. What is this? What has he done to you?" Collins, realizing that the dynamic had shifted violently out of his control, stepped forward, his voice pitching higher in panic. "Wait, you know this guy? He was loitering on the—" "I told you to shut your mouth!" Miller roared, turning his head just enough to shoot Collins a look that could have melted steel. Corporal Davies had already unclipped his radio. "Command, this is Northgate," Davies said, his voice urgent, stripped of all standard protocol. "Get Captain Hayes down here immediately, right now. Tell him Oak Ridge PD just brought in Master Sergeant Pendleton in handcuffs." Wait, Collins stuttered, the bravado evaporating from his body like steam. He looked from the fiercely protective MPs to the quiet black man in the faded jacket. "Master Sergeant, he told me he was an amputee, but I thought—" "You thought what?" A booming voice echoed from the shadows of the guardhouse. Out of the interior office stepped Captain Thomas Hayes, the base's provost marshal. He had been monitoring the gate traffic on the cameras. Hayes was a towering man, his chest adorned with ribbons, his eyes burning with an incandescent rage. He walked purposefully toward the cruiser, the heavy thud of his boots sounding like a death knell to Officer Collins' career. Captain Hayes stopped beside Miller and looked at Cole. He saw the way the cuffs were cutting into the man's wrists. He saw the awkward way Cole was leaning on his right leg to relieve the pressure on his prosthetic. "Cole," Captain Hayes said softly, the anger momentarily giving way to profound apology. "It's all right, Tom," Cole said quietly. "I tried to show him my ID. He was eager to make an arrest." Hayes turned slowly to face Officer Collins. The young cop was now visibly shaking, his hand hovering uselessly over his radio, realizing too late that he hadn't just arrested a trespasser. He had arrested a ghost, a legend, and one of the most revered men in the United States military. "Uncuff him," Captain Hayes whispered. The tone was so low, so lethal, it made the hair on the back of Collins's neck stand up. I can't," Collins stammered, strictly citing police protocol to hide his terror. "He's technically in my custody, in my jurisdiction." "You're on federal property now, officer," Hayes interrupted, stepping within an inch of Collins's face. The captain's voice was a low, terrifying growl. "You have illegally detained a Silver Star recipient, a man who left part of his body in a desert so you could play cowboy in a patrol car. You will take those cuffs off him this second, or by God, I will have my men arrest you for the assault and kidnapping of a decorated American hero. Choose right now. The silence that followed Captain Donovan's ultimatum was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the base's backup generators and the distant caw of a crow. Officer Smith Collins stood frozen, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child dressed in a uniform too big for him. The arrogant swagger that had propelled him through the morning had evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. I... Collins's voice caught in his throat. His eyes darted from Captain Donovan to the furious military police officers and finally rested on the towering, silent figure of Master Sergeant Cole Pendleton. "The keys, officer," Donovan commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth, "before I have Sergeant Miller put you on the concrete and take them from you." With trembling hands that he could no longer control, Collins fumbled at his duty belt. It took him 3 agonizing attempts to unclip his keyring. He stepped forward, his head bowed, not daring to make eye contact with Cole. The metallic click of the handcuffs unlocking sounded deafening in the damp morning air. As the heavy steel cuffs fell away, Cole slowly brought his arms forward. He didn't rub his wrists, though they were wrapped in angry red welts that were already beginning to bruise purple against his dark skin. He simply stood tall, adjusting the collar of his faded field jacket, restoring his own dignity with a quiet, devastating grace. "Sir, we have medical on standby just inside the perimeter," Sergeant Miller said, stepping forward with immediate deference, addressing Cole directly. "Let us get a corpsman to look at your wrists and your shoulder." "Thank you, David, but I'm fine," Cole replied smoothly, his baritone voice steady. "I have an appointment with the general. I'm already running late." Just as the words left his mouth, a sleek, black, government-issued SUV with dark, tinted windows and a small, 2-star flag mounted on the front fender glided into the VIP lane, coming to a smooth halt directly behind Collins's police cruiser. The doors opened, and the atmosphere at the north gate immediately shifted from tense to strictly formal. Out stepped General Thomas Hayes, the base commander of Fort Reynolds. He was a man in his late 50s, with a posture forged from 30 years of command, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wore his Class A uniform, the chest heavy with ribbons, signifying a lifetime of combat and leadership. "Provost Marshal Donovan," General Hayes said, his voice carrying the effortless authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "I was informed there was a situation at the gate involving my guest." Captain Donovan snapped a crisp salute. "Yes, General. Officer Collins of the Oak Ridge Police Department detained Master Sergeant Pendleton on the federal boundary line, sir. He brought him here in restraints." General Hayes stopped in his tracks. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze locking on to Smith Collins. Collins felt his stomach drop into his boots. He felt entirely exposed, stripped of whatever minor municipal authority he possessed. "Is this true, Cole?" General Hayes asked, his tone softening only marginally as he looked at his old friend. "It was a misunderstanding of jurisdiction, General," Cole said diplomatically, though the exhaustion in his eyes told the whole story. "The officer believed I was casing the perimeter." "Casing the perimeter," General Hayes repeated, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. He walked slowly toward Collins, stopping just 2 feet away. The height difference wasn't much, but the general's presence made Collins feel microscopic. "Son," General Hayes began, speaking in a low, dangerously calm register, "do you have any idea who you put in chains today?" "Sir, he was loitering," Collins tried to whisper, but the general cut him off. "You arrested a man who earned the Silver Star in the Korengal Valley. A man who, while bleeding out from a severed limb, laid down suppressing fire so 4 of his wounded men could be medevaced. He left his left leg in the dirt of a foreign country to protect the freedoms you pretend to enforce on your little stretch of highway. Collins swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly tasting like copper. I didn't know, sir. He wasn't in uniform. He just looked like... Like what? General Hayes snapped, closing the final inch between them. Like a criminal? Like someone beneath your respect? Let me be absolutely clear with you, officer. Master Sergeant Pendleton has security clearances that make your police chief look like a mall cop. He has a standing, open invitation to walk any inch of this base at any time of day or night. And you assaulted him on my perimeter. General Hayes turned to Captain Donovan. Captain, I want the dashcam footage from this cruiser subpoenaed immediately. I want the Oak Ridge police chief on my secure line in 10 minutes, and I want this officer off federal property. Donovan nodded sharply. Yes, General. General Hayes turned back to Cole, the fierce anger melting into a look of profound sorrow. I am so sorry, Cole. This is not the welcome you deserved today of all days. Cole offered a faint, acknowledging nod. It's not your fault, Thomas. Let's just get to the chapel. The boys are waiting. As Cole climbed into the warm, spacious interior of the General's SUV, he didn't look back at Collins. He didn't need to. The young officer was standing utterly alone on the cold asphalt, watching his career and his misplaced pride crumble into dust under the glaring floodlights of Fort Reynolds. The interior of the Fort Reynolds Base Chapel was bathed in the soft, fractured light of stained glass. It smelled of polished oak, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of beeswax candles. Unlike the sprawling, heavily populated memorial services held on Memorial Day, this gathering was strictly private, a closed-door communion meant only for the survivors of Echo Company and their families. Cole sat in the front pew, his massive frame perfectly still. The ambient heat of the chapel had finally seeped into his bones, soothing the dull ache in his shoulder where Collins had wrenched it. But the phantom pain in his left leg remained a steady, throbbing companion. General Hayes sat respectfully to his right, while a dozen other veterans from his old platoon occupied the pews behind them. At the front of the chapel, resting on the raised altar, were 4 empty, wooden folding chairs. Propped against each chair was a framed photograph, a set of dog tags, and a pair of highly polished combat boots. Specialist Kyle Henderson, Private First Class Michael Jackson, Sergeant William Davis, Corporal Robert Miller. These were the men who didn't make it to the medevac chopper in time. The men whose lives had bled out into the unforgiving Afghan dust, while Cole fired his M249 squad automatic weapon with one hand, his other attempting to fashion a tourniquet around what was left of his own leg. Chaplain John Matthews stood at the pulpit, delivering a quiet, poignant homily about sacrifice and the heavy, invisible burdens carried by those who return home. But Cole only half heard the words. His mind was drifting back to the cold, foggy perimeter fence where Officer Collins had accosted him. The young cop had accused him of casing the base. He had accused him of looking for a weak point to exploit. The irony was physically painful. Cole hadn't been looking for a way in. He had been looking backward in time. The exact spot on the county road where he had parked his rusted Ford F-150 was not arbitrary. 10 years ago, before the base expanded its modern perimeter and erected the new security towers, that small patch of gravel had been the site of an old off-base dive bar called the Rusty Anchor. It was the very last place Echo Company had gathered to drink cold beer, tell terrible jokes, and make empty promises of invincibility the night before they deployed to Afghanistan. The bar had been torn down years ago, paved over and fenced off by the Department of Defense. But Cole knew the coordinates by heart. Every year, before entering the base for the memorial, he would stop at that exact spot on the perimeter. He would stand by the fence, close his eyes, and remember the sound of Specialist Henderson laughing, the way Sergeant Davis always complained about his boots, and the pure, unadulterated brotherhood they shared in those final, innocent hours. When Officer Collins had dragged him off the truck and slammed him against the hood, Cole's left hand had been reaching into his pocket, not just for his ID, but for a heavy, bronze challenge coin, a unit coin he intended to press into the dirt by the fence line, a private tribute to the ghosts of the Rusty Anchor. "Master Sergeant Pendleton," the chaplain's voice gently cut through Cole's reverie. "Would you care to say a few words?" Cole took a deep breath, grounding himself in the present. He stood up, relying heavily on his right leg to compensate for the stiffness of his prosthetic, and walked slowly to the altar. He didn't stand behind the podium. Instead, he stepped down to the level of the 4 empty chairs, turning to face the small congregation of his brothers-in-arms. He looked at the weary faces in the pews. He saw men missing limbs, men with severe burn scars, and men bearing the invisible, crushing weight of PTSD. He saw real heroes, men who had given everything for a country that often didn't know what to do with them when they returned. 8 years ago today, Cole began, his voice echoing softly in the cavernous chapel. We lost the best parts of ourselves in a valley that didn't care about our names. Henderson, Jackson, Davis, and Miller. They were boys when they deployed, and they became legends when they fell. He paused, glancing down at the heavily bruised skin on his wrists. The contrast between the petty, ego-driven violence he had experienced at the gate and the profound, sacrificial violence these men had endured in combat struck a deep chord within him. "This morning I had a brief encounter with a young man who thought he understood duty," Cole continued, his tone devoid of anger, laced only with a quiet, hardened wisdom. He believed that a uniform and a badge granted him immediate authority, and that fear was a substitute for respect. It reminded me of a harsh truth. True sacrifice is silent. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't bully. It simply stands in the gap between the wolves and the flock, regardless of whether the flock says thank you. He stepped closer to the chairs, reaching out to gently touch the frame holding Corporal Miller's photograph. "We do not wear our medals so the world can applaud us," Cole said, his voice thickening with emotion. "We wear them as heavy, metal headstones for the men who couldn't come back. We live the rest of our lives for them, and we must never let the ignorance or the arrogance of those who haven't bled diminish the sacredness of what we left behind." General Hayes wiped a solitary tear from his weathered cheek. The chapel sat in absolute, breathless silence. Cole placed his hand over his heart, bowed his head to the 4 empty chairs, and limped quietly back to his pew, the echoes of his footsteps serving as a solemn drumbeat for the fallen. The drive back to the Oak Ridge Municipal Police Department was the longest 4 miles of Smith Collins' life. He drove exactly the speed limit, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The heater in the cruiser was blasting, but he felt freezing cold, shivering violently under his polyester uniform. He was trying to build a defense in his head. He was on the county side of the gravel. He refused a direct order. He was resisting. I was following standard Terry stop protocols. But every time he tried to mentally fortify his position, the terrifying, booming voice of General Hayes echoed in his skull. He left his left leg in the dirt of a foreign country. Collins pulled into the rear parking lot of the precinct. The heavy steel door to the station usually felt like the entrance to his own personal kingdom, a place where he was part of an untouchable brotherhood. Today, it felt like the door to an execution chamber. As he walked into the bullpen, the atmosphere was dead silent. 5 other officers were at their desks. Nobody looked up. Nobody offered the usual morning banter. The shift sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Miller, deliberately turned his back as Collins walked past. The word had already come down. "Collins," a sharp voice cracked from the second floor. Chief Richard Harrison stood at the top of the stairs, leaning over the railing. Harrison was a no-nonsense administrator who had spent 30 years building the department's reputation. His face was a mask of furious, unyielding stone. "My office. Now." Collins swallowed the lump in his throat and trudged up the stairs. The walk of shame felt interminable. He entered the chief's office and stood at attention, not daring to sit down. Sitting in one of the leather guest chairs opposite the chief's desk was a man Collins didn't recognize. A man in a sharp civilian suit, but possessing a posture so rigidly military it made Collins's stomach turn over. Chief Harrison slammed the office door shut with enough force to rattle the glass panes. He didn't walk to his desk. He walked straight up to Collins, stopping inches from his face. "Give me your badge and give me your gun," Harrison demanded, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "Chief, please, let me explain." "I did not ask for an explanation, Smith," Harrison roared, his composure finally breaking. "I asked for your badge and your service weapon. Do it now, or I will arrest you myself for insubordination." Speaking uncontrollably, Collins unclipped his holster, setting his Glock 19 on the desk. He fumbled with the pin on his chest, pulling off his silver badge and laying it next to the gun. It felt as though he was stripping off his very identity. "Do you know who this gentleman is?" Harrison asked, pointing a trembling finger at the man in the suit. "This is Special Agent David Croft, FBI liaison to the Department of Defense. He has been sitting in my office for the last 20 minutes, playing me a very interesting piece of audio." Agent Croft did not smile. He opened a slim silver laptop on his lap and tapped a key. Instantly, the audio from Collins's own dash cam and body mic filled the room. "I didn't say reach into your jacket. Keep your hands where I can see them. On the hood of the truck, now." "Officer, my wallet is in my breast pocket. Inside it is my Department of Defense identification. I am an invited guest of General Hayes." "Yeah, sure you are. And I'm the president." "Spread your legs." Chief Harrison hit the spacebar on his own keyboard, silencing the recording. He stared at Collins with a look of pure disgust. "You didn't just break protocol, Collins. You committed assault under color of law. You illegally detained a citizen. And to make it worse, you did it on a federal boundary line, which brings the FBI and the DOD right into my precinct." "Chief, the turnout is on county land," Collins argued weakly, clinging to his last shred of defense. The gravel is federal property, you absolute idiot," Harrison shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "The county line ends at the asphalt. You assaulted a decorated combat veteran on federal land, threw him in cuffs, aggravated his war injuries, and paraded him like a trophy to the military police." Agent Croft finally spoke, his voice clinically detached and utterly devastating. "Mr. Collins, as we speak, the Judge Advocate General's office at Fort Reynolds is drafting a formal complaint. Because you crossed into federal jurisdiction and detained a high-level military asset without cause or proper procedure, you are looking at federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, and potentially kidnapping." Collins's knees buckled. He reached out to grab the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. "Kidnapping? No, I was doing my job. I thought he was a threat. He wouldn't comply. He offered you his military ID, and you told him you were the president," Harrison sneered, leaning over his desk. "Oak Ridge survives on federal grants tied to Fort Reynolds. Half our budget relies on our cooperative relationship with the base command. General Hayes just informed me that unless you are permanently removed from law enforcement, he will sever all municipal ties with this department, ban our cruisers from cutting through base roads, and petition the state to pull our highway funding. Harrison leaned back, crossing his arms. You didn't just end your career today, Smith. You almost bankrupted this entire town because you wanted to play tough guy with a black man in a rusty truck. Collins was openly weeping now, the tears of a man who realized the absolute permanence of his actions. Chief, please, I'll apologize. I'll go to the base right now. I'll get on my knees. Please don't let them file federal charges. It is entirely out of my hands, Harrison said coldly. You are terminated, effective immediately, with prejudice. You will never wear a badge in this state or any other state, ever again. Agent Croft will escort you to holding. You are officially under federal arrest. Agent Croft stood up, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Ironically, the exact same brand Collins had used just hours earlier. Hands behind your back, Mr. Collins, Croft said flatly. As the cold steel snapped around his wrists, Smith Collins squeezed his eyes shut. The twist of fate was absolute. He had started the day looking for a victim to elevate his own ego, convinced that the uniform made him invincible. Now, stripped of his badge, his gun, and his freedom, he finally understood the lesson Master Sergeant Cole Pendleton had tried to teach him on the foggy perimeter. Authority is not granted by a piece of metal on your chest. It is earned through sacrifice. And Collins had just sacrificed everything for nothing. The United States District Court in Richmond, Virginia, was a cathedral of mahogany and polished marble, a stark contrast to the dreary municipal holding cells where Smith Collins had spent the last 3 weeks. Stripped of his tailored uniform, Collins now wore a shapeless, standard-issue olive jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were shackled with heavy iron chains. As he was led into the courtroom by 2 armed U.S. Marshals, the metallic clinking of his chains echoed off the vaulted ceiling, a cruel, auditory reminder of the cuffs he had slapped onto a war hero. The gallery was packed. Word of the local cop who had arrested a Silver Star amputee on federal property had leaked to the press, sparking a national outrage. Veterans groups had protested outside the Oak Ridge precinct. The state governor had publicly condemned him. Collins wasn't just a disgraced officer. He had become the face of unchecked authority and systemic arrogance. Sitting at the defense table next to an overworked public defender, Collins kept his eyes glued to the scuffed hardwood floor. He was facing federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, and a charge of false imprisonment on a federal installation. The prosecution, backed by the full weight of the Department of Defense, was pushing for a 10-year mandatory sentence in a federal penitentiary. His life, at 26 years old, was effectively over. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, pulling the collective gaze of the gallery. Master Sergeant Cole Pendleton walked down the center aisle. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. He moved with a slow, dignified rhythm, his carbon fiber cane tapping softly against the floor to support his prosthetic leg. He was not accompanied by military brass or an entourage of angry veterans. He walked alone, carrying a calm, impenetrable aura that silenced the whispers in the room. Judge Robert Caldwell, a stern, white-haired jurist known for his unforgiving sentences, banged his gavel. Court is in session. We are here for the sentencing phase of the United States versus Smith Collins. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed attorney named Sarah Jenkins, stood up. Your Honor, the government's position is clear. The defendant abused his power, violated federal jurisdiction, and assaulted a decorated veteran who had given his own flesh and blood for this country. We ask for the maximum sentence of 10 years to send a message that this conduct will not be tolerated. Judge Caldwell nodded gravely, adjusting his glasses. He looked down at Collins, his expression one of deep disgust. Mr. Collins, before I hand down my sentence, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Collins stood up, his chains rattling loudly. His hands trembled so violently he had to grip the edge of the defense table to steady himself. He looked back at Cole, tears welling in his red, exhausted eyes. "I'm sorry," Collins choked out, his voice cracking, devoid of any of the bravado he had wielded on the foggy perimeter. "I was arrogant. I was stupid. I thought the badge made me better than everyone else. I didn't see a hero that day. I just saw a target. I am so deeply, truly sorry, Master Sergeant." It was a pathetic, broken apology, but it was genuine. The courtroom remained completely silent. "Your Honor?" Cole's deep, steady baritone cut through the heavy air. He stood up from the front row of the gallery. "If it pleases the court, as the victim in this case, I would like to submit a statement." Judge Caldwell's expression softened immediately. "Of course, Master Sergeant Pendleton. You have the floor." Cole stepped toward the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. He looked directly at Collins. There was no hatred in Cole's eyes, nor was there any triumph. There was only a profound, heavy wisdom. "Your Honor," Cole began, his voice echoing clearly. "When I was lying in the dirt of the Korangal Valley, bleeding from a leg that was no longer there, I didn't fight to survive so I could come home and put another young man in a cage. I have seen enough destroyed lives. I have seen enough young men broken by systems they do not understand." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor frowned in confusion. "Mr. Collins committed a grievous error," Cole continued, leaning slightly on his cane. "He acted with malice, prejudice, and breathtaking ignorance. If you send him to a federal penitentiary for 10 years, he will not learn respect. He will only learn resentment. He will spend a decade surrounded by hardened criminals, and he will emerge a bitter, broken man. That does not serve justice. That only adds another casualty to a very long list." Judge Caldwell leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. "What are you proposing, Master Sergeant?" Cole reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored document. "I have spoken with the Judge Advocate General and Base Commander General Hayes. We have agreed to drop the federal false imprisonment charge, provided the court accepts an alternative sentence for the remaining misdemeanor assault and deprivation of rights." The twist hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Collins gasped, his knees buckling slightly, saved only by the grip of his attorney. "I am proposing a lifetime ban from law enforcement, at any level, anywhere in the United States," Cole stated, his tone firm, "coupled with 5 years of supervised probation. But most importantly, Your Honor, I am requesting that Mr. Collins be sentenced to 3,000 hours of mandatory community service at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda." Cole took a step closer to the defense table, his eyes locking onto Collins. "You will not carry a gun, Smith. You will carry bedpans. You will change bandages. You will push wheelchairs. You will spend the next 3 years of your life looking into the eyes of young men and women who have lost arms, legs, their sight, and their peace of mind for the freedoms you took for granted. You will learn, intimately, the price of the liberty you once pretended to enforce. And you will not leave that hospital until you truly understand the meaning of the word sacrifice." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a sentence far heavier than a prison cell. It was a sentence of forced empathy, a brutal, daily confrontation with the very reality Collins had mocked. Judge Caldwell stared at Cole for a long, quiet minute. A slow, respectful nod finally broke his stillness. "It is rare that this court sees such profound grace," Judge Caldwell said softly. He raised his gavel. I accept the victim's proposal. The federal felony charges are dismissed. Mr. Collins, you are sentenced to 3,000 hours at Walter Reed Medical Center, a lifetime ban from public office and law enforcement, and 5 years probation. If you miss a single day of your service, I will reinstate the 10-year sentence. Court is adjourned. The crack of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. Collins collapsed back into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably into his chained hands. He wasn't crying out of fear anymore. He was crying because he had just been handed his life back by a man he had treated as less than human. As the courtroom cleared, Cole turned and walked slowly down the center aisle. He didn't wait for Collins to thank him. He didn't need validation. His duty was done. 3 days later, as the dawn fog once again blanketed the foothills of Virginia, a rusted 2004 Ford F-150 pulled onto a gravel turnout bordering the chain-link fence of Fort Reynolds. Cole stepped out, zipping up his faded field jacket against the biting cold. He limped slowly toward the perimeter line. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a heavy bronze challenge coin bearing the insignia of Echo Company. He knelt down with great effort, pressing the coin deep into the damp, cold earth, right where the rusty anchor used to be. He stood up, resting his hand on the cold chain-link fence, and smiled. For the first time in 8 years, the heavy, suffocating weight on his chest had lifted. Justice had not been found in retribution, but in redemption. And out there in the fog, the ghosts of his brothers were finally at peace. If this story of humility, justice, and the true meaning of sacrifice moved you, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends and family to spread its powerful message. We often forget the heavy burdens carried by our veterans, and stories like Cole's remind us of the quiet dignity of true heroes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our gripping, real-life inspired stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Cole's shoes? Thank you for watching.